It is funny how when we look back at historical figures, we have this intense need to just, categorize them. We really have this expectation of categorization.
Oh, absolutely. We love our little historical filing cabinets, right?
Exactly.
Well,
like you pull up a famous general and you look at the battles and the treaties and you just slap a label in the folder that says, conqueror.
Right. Or you look at a philosopher, you catalog their treatises, and you say, okay, this one is a thinker.
Yeah, it is very binary, it is clean, and it fits neatly into our brains.
Mm-hmm.
But for today's deep dive, we are jumping into a source that essentially takes an entire filing cabinet and just, shatters it into a million pieces.
It really does. We are looking at Rian Engelbrecht's book, Jesus Part 1, and his entire premise is built on this idea that humanity has spent 2,000 years trying to shrink this staggeringly complex identity down into something manageable.
Something that fits into our 21st century pockets, right? Because if you are listening to this, you are probably someone who loves getting to the core of complex subjects without wanting to feel completely overwhelmed. And that is exactly our mission today. We are unpacking the highly layered identity of Jesus Christ as Engelbrecht presents it.
And he actually starts the whole thing with this ultimate diagnostic question. It is pulled right from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, where Jesus asks, "Who do men say that I am?"
Right. That is the core question. And Engelbrecht argues that society's answers to that question are, almost always reductive. We strip away the parts that intimidate us.
We really do. We leave this Santa Claus prototype, right? A figure who exists just to hand out blessings when we ask nicely.
Yeah, or we reduce him down to just a mere historical figure, like a great moral teacher who had some, really solid advice on loving your neighbor, or maybe an esoteric master of ancient wisdom.
But Engelbrecht just flat out refuses to let the reader settle for any of those comfortable reductions. He forces you into a direct confrontation with the text.
Because to understand the different roles, you really have to establish the absolute bedrock first, right?
Exactly. You cannot evaluate the empathy of the man or the authority of the king without first wrestling with this unapologetic claim of absolute deity.
He brings in C.S. Lewis's famous trilemma here.
Oh, the liar, lunatic, or Lord thing.
Yes, exactly. But he doesn't just use it as standard apologetics. He uses it to emphasize that the source material simply does not offer the great moral teacher option. It is not on the menu.
Which is fascinating because I think people lean on that moral teacher option because, it demands the least amount of surrender from you.
Oh, for sure. It is safe.
Right. If he is just a teacher, you can, audit his class, you take the nice advice on forgiveness, and you just leave all the supernatural claims at the door. But Engelbrecht points to that moment in John 8, where Jesus is debating the religious leaders.
Yeah, the before Abraham was I am moment. Yes. And for the audience standing there, who already understood the weight of the burning bush narrative from Exodus, that is a linguistic absolute. It is not him saying, hey, I am similar to God.
Right. It is a direct claim of identity. It is the uncreated creator asserting himself right there in time and space.
So the foundation of his identity in this book is this eternal present tense. He is not reacting to history. He is actually generating it.
Exactly. But establishing that bedrock of deity instantly forces Engelbrecht to navigate something incredibly difficult, the sheer mechanical complexity of the Trinity.
Oh, man, yeah. The idea of God being one, yet three distinct persons. He spends a massive chunk of the text on this.
He does, and he is very open about how difficult it is to map that concept onto human logic.
Because we are just, flesh-encased beings. We are totally constrained by 3D space and time. Trying to comprehend a Godhead that is completely unconstrained by those things is just inherently frustrating.
It breaks our mental architecture.
It really does. It makes me think of trying to explain a three-dimensional object to a two-dimensional drawing. Like imagine a stick figure drawn on a flat piece of paper.
Okay, I am picturing it.
If I take a 3D cube and push it through that flat paper, the stick figure doesn't see a cube. Their 2D mind literally lacks the architectural capacity to grasp it. They just see a flat square that suddenly appears, maybe changes shape, and then disappears.
That is a brilliant analogy. The 2D mind just cannot process the 3D reality, which makes Engelbrecht's really firm stance on Trinitarian theology so interesting here.
Yeah, because he acknowledges that cognitive barrier, but then he goes on this sharp critique of, the oneness or Jesus-only doctrines.
Right, the doctrines that try to simplify the Godhead by collapsing the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit into just a single changing mode of one person.
And see, that is where I actually found a bit of tension in his argument. I mean, if he openly admits that our human logic completely fails at conceptualizing the Trinity, why is he so rigid about it?
What do you mean?
Well, why does his framework insist that we have to hold all three persons simultaneously in our minds if he just admitted our cognitive architecture is destined to fail at that task anyway?
Yeah.
Like, what is the actual practical danger of a simplified Jesus-only model?
Ah, I see. For Engelbrecht, it is not about passing a test in theological mathematics. It is entirely about the mechanics of grace and redemption.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So, in his analysis, if you minimize any part of the Godhead, you essentially break the mechanical chain of salvation. He breaks it down into distinct operational roles. The Father initiates the plan from outside of time.
Okay, right.
The Son executes that plan within the physical constraints of flesh and history. And then the Holy Spirit empowers the believer to actually live out the result of that plan.
Oh, wow. So if you collapse them all into one, you lose those distinct operational roles.
Precisely. You lose the functional necessity of each person. Engelbrecht uses the baptism of Jesus to illustrate this really well.
Oh, where they are all present at once.
Exactly. You have the Son physically standing in the Jordan River, you have the Spirit descending in a visible form like a dove, and you have the Father providing the audible validation from heaven.
They are functioning simultaneously, but in distinct roles toward a singular objective. So the distinction isn't just arbitrary ancient dogma to him.
No, not at all. It is recognizing how the machinery of salvation actually operates. To ignore the Father or the Spirit just to focus exclusively on Jesus is, in his view, a fundamental misunderstanding of the authority that Jesus himself operated under.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that concept of authority naturally bleeds into his deep dive on the name of Jesus, which honestly is a massive debate right now.
Oh, the linguistic purity debate. It is everywhere in modern theological circles.
Yeah. You have these factions arguing that using transliterations like Jesus strips away the Jewish context. They insist that true believers have to use the Hebrew Yeshua.
And it often devolves into some pretty intense linguistic gatekeeping.
Totally. But Engelbrecht cuts through that entire debate with, surprising pragmatism.
He really does. He traces the etymology from the Hebrew Yeshua to the Greek Isus, down to the Latin Isus, and finally the English Jesus. And his conclusion is basically that the phonetic syllables are entirely secondary.
Yes. He separates the linguistic vehicle from the actual payload. The spelling and the language do not alter the object they describe.
Right. Because he argues that the power to, say, drive out darkness or bring healing, it does not reside in pronouncing a sequence of vowels correctly.
Like it's some sort of magical incantation or a spell from Harry Potter.
Exactly. It's not a magic word. The power resides entirely in the relationship with the person backing the name. It is the authority of the great I Am that enforces the outcome.
So if a believer is calling on the Lord with genuine relational intent, the divine authority backs that claim, whether the language they are speaking is ancient Hebrew or modern English.
Yes, the language changes, but the object itself, the authority, does not.
But, establishing this limitless, uncreated authority creates a really profound problem.
How so?
Well, limitless authority without a tether to the human experience is absolutely terrifying. Think about it. A supreme deity interacting with a breaking, hurting world from this untouchable distance. That is a recipe for cosmic tyranny, or at best, just cold indifference.
Oh, I see what you mean. God could simply squash the rebellion of humanity and start over without a second thought.
Right. So Engelbrecht's framework requires this massive pivot. We have to move from these staggering heights of deity straight down to the grounded, dusty vulnerability of flesh.
And that pivot is anchored in the title Jesus actually chose for himself more frequently than any other in the biblical text, the Son of Man.
Yeah, that always stood out to me. The crowds and the disciples were always so quick to use Son of God or Messiah.
Because those titles overtly signaled divine origin and conquering power. They wanted a conqueror. But Jesus repeatedly self-identified with radical humanity instead.
It is such an intentional identification with the frailty of the human race. He wasn't simply God wearing a human suit, or operating a biological drone from heaven.
No, Engelbrecht emphasizes the striking contrasts of the incarnation to prove that point. Think about it. The entity that literally spoke the physics of the universe into existence becomes a completely vulnerable infant.
Totally dependent on earthly parents just to survive the night.
Exactly. The one who identifies as the bread of life experiences genuine, gnawing physical hunger out in the wilderness. The source of living water feels actual, agonizing thirst on the cross.
He details this absolute submission to human limitations to establish the totality of the incarnation. He had to learn how to walk. He endured extreme temperatures.
He experienced the slow and honestly often painful process of human physical development.
You know, it pushes way past that modern cliche of the undercover boss.
Oh, I love that show, where the CEO goes down to the factory floor.
Right. The CEO puts on a fake mustache and works the assembly line to understand the workers' struggles. But the problem with that analogy is that a CEO working undercover can always shed the disguise. When things get too hard, they can walk away from the assembly line and return to their insulated, air-conditioned mansion at the end of the shift. Their vulnerability is completely synthetic.
That is a profound distinction, because Jesus, according to Engelbrecht's reading of the text, made himself fundamentally vulnerable to the irreversible realities of the human condition.
Right. He couldn't just call a timeout when the Roman scourge came out and say, okay, back to immortality now. He felt the sting of betrayal, the physical trauma, and the biological cessation of death.
And the theological engine driving that total submission to vulnerability is found in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, which Engelbrecht leans on heavily here.
Okay, break that down for us.
The mechanism at work here is not sympathy, it is empathy. And there is a massive difference between the two. Sympathy is observing someone down in a deep pit, looking over the edge and feeling sorry for them.
Empathy is actually climbing down into the pit, feeling the cold mud on your own hands, and experiencing the exact same despair.
Yes. Knowing the precise frequency of human suffering, the author argues that because the Son of Man experienced the full spectrum of the human condition navigating childhood, the awkwardness of adolescence, the stress of adulthood,
facing exhaustion and grief, like weeping over the death of his friend Lazarus.
Right, and facing the psychological terror of his own impending execution. Because he went through all of that, he possesses a high priestly empathy that is not just theoretical.
So when you, the listener, bring your anxiety or your trauma to him, he actually recognizes the exact biological and emotional weight of that experience.
He has felt it in his own nervous system. But, empathy alone is actually insufficient.
Wait, really? Why?
Well, think about your pit analogy. I can climb down into the pit with you, and I can perfectly understand your suffering and sit in the mud with you. But if neither of us has a ladder, we're just going to die in the dark together.
Oh, wow. That is bleak, but incredibly accurate. Empathy without a solution is just shared doom.
Exactly. Empathy demands provision. Because he deeply understands the human condition as the Son of Man, he knows exactly what is required to rescue humanity, and this forces the transition in Engelbrecht's framework.
A transition from the empathetic Son of Man to the fierce provision of the Good Shepherd.
Yes, and to build this point, Engelbrecht really unpacks the cultural and socio-economic realities of ancient Middle Eastern shepherding.
Which is so helpful, because most of us don't know the first thing about raising sheep.
Right. He points out that sheep are incredibly unique among domesticated livestock because of their profound helplessness. They are hardwired followers.
They graze with their heads down, completely oblivious to approaching predators.
Exactly. They lack natural defenses. They don't have claws. They don't have venom. They have no real speed to run away.
Their survival is like 100% dependent on the constant intervention of the shepherd for navigation, for hydration, and for defense.
So using sheep as the primary metaphor for humanity's spiritual state is actually a brutal indictment of our illusion of self-sufficiency.
It totally dismantles human arrogance. We like to think of ourselves as wolves or lions, but the text is like, nope, you're a sheep, you need help.
It really does. And to further illustrate the nature of the Good Shepherd, Engelbrecht brings in this stark contrast found in Ezekiel 34 and the Gospel of John. The concept of the hireling.
Oh, the hirelings. They are basically the mercenaries of leadership.
Yes, exactly. Ezekiel 34 lays out this devastating critique of Israel's political and religious elite at the time.
The text describes leaders who view the flock merely as a resource to be extracted. They consume the milk, they clothe themselves in the wool, they slaughter the fat sheep, but they completely refuse to strengthen the weak or search for the lost ones.
The defining characteristic of the hireling is their motivation. Their attachment to the flock is purely transactional.
So the second a wolf appears on the horizon,
the hireling instantly calculates the risk. They realize the paycheck is not worth their life, and they abandon the sheep without a second thought. The hireling extracts value, but the Good Shepherd preserves value by actively absorbing the threat.
Engelbrecht points out that Jesus explicitly states the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. It is not an accident. It is an intentional, sacrificial absorption of the violence that was intended for the flock.
Which brings us to one of the most honestly, mechanically fascinating metaphors in the entire book. Jesus declaring, "I am the door of the sheep."
Yeah, for a modern reader, that immediately conjures up an image of a literal wooden gate on metal hinges.
But Engelbrecht reconstructs the actual architecture of an ancient open-air sheepfold. These were not barns. They were simply rough circles of piled stones with a single narrow break in the wall for the sheep to enter and exit.
Right. There was no physical wooden door to close at night.
No, the physical mechanism of the door was the shepherd himself. At night, the shepherd would literally lay his physical body across that opening in the rocks to sleep.
That is incredible. So nothing could attack the flock without physically going through the shepherd first, and no sheep could wander off into the darkness without stepping over him. He literally embodied the barrier.
It creates this incredibly vivid image of absolute security, but it also forces a confrontation with the extreme exclusivity of the claim.
Oh, for sure, because Jesus doesn't offer himself as a door or just one of many valid entry points into the sheepfold. He claims to be the singular door.
And in modern society, any claim of absolute exclusivity is immediately branded as arrogant gatekeeping. It sounds deeply elitist to assert that all other philosophies or spiritual leaders are invalid entry points.
Yeah, people hate that today. So how does Engelbrecht justify this rigid exclusivity without completely alienating the modern mind?
He justifies it by analyzing the nature of the threat. In Engelbrecht's reading, this exclusivity is not arbitrary border control designed to keep people out.
Okay, so what is it?
It is a vital security protocol designed to keep the threat out. The other ways attempting to enter the sheepfold are explicitly identified by Jesus as thieves and wolves.
Oh, right. Because if someone tries to climb over the stone wall instead of walking through the shepherd at the door, their intent is clearly hostile. They want to bypass the security protocol to steal, kill, or destroy.
Exactly. So the exclusivity of the single door is actually the only guarantee of safety, because only the Son of God possessed both the capacity and the willingness to lay his life across that gap.
It totally reframes exclusivity. It is not like a bouncer holding a VIP list at a club. It is more like a firefighter throwing their body over a trapped child. It's exclusive because there is literally only one person capable of taking the flames.
Any other proposed door is just an illusion that will collapse the second the fire reaches it.
Wow. And that sacrificial provision connects directly to the mechanism of brokenness, which Engelbrecht explores next to the metaphor of Jesus as the bread of life.
Right. The provision of the shepherd shifts here from external security against wolves to internal sustenance for the flock.
Engelbrecht analyzes the actual physics of bread to explain the theology of the cross, which I found fascinating.
It is so practical. Whether you look at the feeding of the 5,000 or the Last Supper, a whole loaf of bread only feeds the person holding it.
Right. To distribute its life-sustaining value to the masses, the bread has to undergo physical trauma. It must be broken apart.
Which highlights the theological tragedy of an unbroken Savior.
If Jesus, as the perfect, unleavened, sinless bread, simply lives a perfect life, and then returns to heaven without ever going to the cross, he remains whole.
But he also remains entirely isolated in his perfection. His perfection cannot be distributed to humanity unless the structural integrity of his physical life is violently broken.
Engelbrecht makes it so clear that the breaking was the required mechanism for spiritual multiplication. The empathy of the Son of Man leads to the protective sacrifice of the shepherd, which inevitably necessitates the violent breaking of the bread.
But, here is the inherent flaw of the Good Shepherd model if it just ends at the cross.
What do you mean?
Well, a shepherd who dies for the sheep is incredibly loving, right?
Yeah, the ultimate sacrifice.
But if he stays dead, the wolves simply step over his body and eat the sheep the very next day. Empathy and sacrifice are ultimately completely useless without absolute power.
Oh, man. That is so true. And that is exactly where Engelbrecht forces us to look at the resurrection, not just as a neat miracle, but as a literal coronation. The suffering lamb has to transition into the conquering King of Kings.
He explores this transition through the dual imagery of Revelation 5, which captures the paradox of this authority perfectly.
Let's set the scene for us there.
Okay, so John the Revelator is weeping in despair. He sees this scroll, which essentially represents the title Deed to the Earth, or the execution of divine justice. But no entity in the entire universe is worthy to break its seals.
Until the elder tells John to stop weeping, because the Lion of the tribe of Judah has triumphed.
Exactly. But when John turns to look at this ultimate apex predator, this conquering lion, he doesn't see a roaring beast standing over its prey. The text says he sees a lamb looking as if it had been slain.
It is the ultimate subversion of how humanity understands power. I mean, earthly kings conquer by inflicting violence and shedding the blood of their enemies. But the Lion of Judah conquered by absorbing the violence of the world and shedding his own blood.
The victory of the king is permanently linked to the sacrifice of the lamb. It is inseparable. And Engelbrecht contrasts this eternal sacrificial dominion with the temporary nature of earthly empires.
He points to the prophet Daniel's vision, right? The giant statue.
Yes, the statue is composed of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. It represents the succession of massive, seemingly invincible human empires. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome.
And to the people living under those empires, they appear terrifyingly permanent.
But then a stone, cut out without human hands, strikes the fragile feet of the statue, and the entire towering structure of human geopolitical power crumbles to dust and just blows away in the wind.
While that small stone grows into a mountain that fills the entire earth, Engelbrecht uses this to prove that earthly empires, regardless of their military might or their economic dominance, they always have an expiration date.
Always. Borders collapse, dictators die, and regimes fade into history. But the kingdom established by Jesus is characterized by immortality.
He cannot be voted out, he cannot be overthrown, and his reign does not degrade over time.
And his method of ruling is entirely unique. Engelbrecht details this by diving into the very complex theology of the Order of Melchizedek.
Oh, this part was wild. Because in the historical architecture of ancient Israel, the two primary offices of power were strictly quarantined from one another.
Right. The king, who hailed from the tribe of Judah, held executive and military authority. But the priest, who hailed from the tribe of Levi, held the mediating, sacrificial, and spiritual authority.
They were never allowed to mix. It makes me think of the modern equivalent of the nuclear launch protocol. You know, you never give the launch codes and the physical key to the exact same person.
Because human nature is fundamentally corruptible.
Exactly. If you give one flawed human being absolute military control and absolute spiritual or moral authority over the populace, the inevitable result is tyranny. You separate the powers to prevent the system from detonating.
Like when King Uzziah decided he wanted to act as a priest and bring incense in the temple, the system reacted violently, and he was struck with leprosy. The quarantine was non-negotiable.
Because flawed humans simply cannot handle absolute power. But Engelbrecht explains that Jesus fulfilling the mysterious ancient order of Melchizedek, this figure from Genesis, who is simultaneously the king of Salem and the priest of God Most High, it is the ultimate disruption of that quarantine.
Because Jesus is the sinless Son of Man and the divine Son of God, he possesses the unique spiritual and genetic clearance to hold both keys simultaneously.
He is literally the only figure in history who can hold absolute power without corrupting the system. As the righteous king, he dictates the law with absolute unyielding authority. But as the compassionate high priest, he perfectly mediates for the subjects who break that law.
Ultimately offering himself as the penalty. He is the lawgiver, the lawkeeper, and the sacrifice.
Okay, so having mapped out this massive, multi-layered architecture of identity, the absolute deity, the empathetic human, the sacrificial provider, and the uncorruptible king-priest, Engelbrecht then takes the analytical lens and turns it directly onto the reader.
Yes, the so what of it all. If this is the true identity of the king, what does that dictate about the identity of the subjects? We are fundamentally defined by the entity we choose to follow.
He strips away all the fluff of modern discipleship and presents this brutal mathematical formula pulled straight from Matthew 16.
It is an equation. Following Jesus plus denying yourself plus carrying your cross equals a disciple of God.
It is basic addition, but the variables require absolute surrender. And Engelbrecht uses this equation to launch a really sharp critique of what he calls churchianity.
Oh, yeah. He argues that vast swaths of modern believers are not actually following the king at all. They are following the localized miniature kingdoms of celebrity pastors or comfortable traditions or self-help doctrines.
And his point is, if your identity is anchored to a human leader or a specific organizational ideology, you fail the very first variable of the equation. You are building on a foundation that will inevitably shift and collapse.
But, there is a tension here that we need to talk about between the requirement of the cross and the concept of grace.
Yes, because he sets up this grueling equation of self-denial and cross-bearing. But earlier in the text, he heavily emphasizes the concept of pure sonship based on the baptism of Jesus.
Right. At the baptism, the Father declares, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased."
And the crucial factor there is that this declaration occurs before Jesus has performed a single miracle, before any ministry output, and long before the cross. His identity as the beloved is secured entirely independent of his productivity.
So how does Engelbrecht reconcile the free grace of being a beloved sinner daughter with the grueling, bloody work of carrying a cross?
Yeah, how does he thread that needle?
He reconciles it by identifying the motivation. The cross-bearing is not the payment required to purchase the sonship. It is the natural, necessary output of a life that has already secured the sonship.
Oh, I see.
Engelbrecht argues that our primary ancient design is not to produce things for God, but to simply be in relation with him. He actually uses the cultural touchstone of The Little Drummer Boy to highlight this.
The Christmas song.
Yes. The premise of the song is that a poor boy has no material wealth to offer the newborn king.
Which is accurate, because,
Yeah.
seriously, what physical asset could you possibly hand to the entity that altered the carbon in the universe? You cannot enrich God.
Precisely. The only thing the Creator does not inherently possess is the voluntary affection and relationship of a creature endowed with free will.
Because forced love isn't love.
Right. So the drummer boy offers his time, his attention, and his affection by simply playing his drum. He gives himself. Engelbrecht argues that the grueling work of the cross, the denying of self, is merely the process of stripping away everything that distracts us from playing our drum for the king.
Wow. And he maps this journey of intimacy over the architectural blueprint of the Old Testament tabernacle, which is just a brilliant spatial metaphor.
It is incredibly profound. Walk us through how he lays that out.
Okay, so the tabernacle was divided into 3 distinct zones. You have the outer court, where the bronze altar sits, representing initial salvation and the washing away of sin.
Right, the entry point.
And then you move deeper into the holy place. This houses the lampstand and the table of showbread. This represents operating in the gifts of the Spirit, doing ministry, and basically being productive for the kingdom.
But that isn't the final destination.
Exactly. The final innermost zone is the Holy of Holies. This contains the Ark of the Covenant and the raw, unfiltered presence of the Father.
And Engelbrecht's critique here is that a massive percentage of believers get entirely stuck in the holy place.
They become obsessed with the activities, the church ministries, the utilization of spiritual gifts, the production of religious output. They confuse serving the king with knowing the king.
But the ultimate design of the tabernacle and of the cross itself was to tear the veil so that humanity could push completely through the holy place and enter the Holy of Holies.
The goal is pure sonship and daughtership, sitting in the presence of the Father without an agenda to produce anything.
But how does a listener actually operationalize this in their daily life? Engelbrecht writes about how this anchored identity gives us a legal right to victory.
Right, but when you're dealing with a toxic workplace or navigating a severe medical diagnosis or just drowning in the anxiety of the modern economy, what does it actually mean to exercise a legal right of victory based on ancient theology?
He ties this directly back to the victory of the line of Judah. Because the king has already conquered sin, death, and the systems of the world, those who are adopted into his family inherit the legal standing of that conquest.
The covenant is sealed by blood, making it legally binding in the spiritual realm.
Practically, Engelbrecht argues this gives you, the listener, the covenantal authority to step out of the frequency of anxiety.
So when the world hands you a narrative of panic or defeat regarding your health and your finances, your identity as royalty in an unshakable kingdom means you do not have to accept that narrative as your final reality.
Exactly. You don't respond with the panic of an orphan. You respond with the quiet, unshakable confidence of an heir whose father controls the ultimate outcome, and whose shepherd is physically blocking the door to the sheepfold.
So, if we trace the causal chain of Engelbrecht's entire argument today, we see this masterful progression.
We really do.
We start with the unyielding bedrock of the great I Am, the absolute deity. Because that deity refuses to be a distant tyrant, he submits to the profound vulnerability of the Son of Man to achieve exact empathy with our pain.
And that empathy necessitates action, transforming him into the fiercely protective Good Shepherd and the broken bread of life.
But sacrifice without supreme authority is tragic. So the shepherd resurrects as the uncorruptible King of Kings, holding both the executive and priestly keys. And finally, that supreme king invites us to anchor our chaotic identities entirely in his permanent victory.
It is a devastatingly complete picture, one that completely refuses to let the reader settle for a simplified, pocket-sized savior.
In an era defined by information overload, where thousands of ideologies, influencers, and hirelings are constantly demanding your allegiance and attempting to define your reality, Engelbrecht's text is a demand to audit your inputs.
Are you absorbing the anxious narratives of hirelings who will abandon you when the economy or the culture shifts? Or is your identity anchored to the eternal stone that crushes temporary empires?
It all hinges on who is defining your reality. As we close out this analysis, there is a fascinating, almost mystical concept from the final pages of Engelbrecht's book that we want to leave you to wrestle with.
Yes, he introduces the idea of Jesus functioning as the ultimate firmament.
He draws this from the creation narrative in Genesis, right? Where the firmament was the massive solid expanse established by God to separate the chaotic waters below from the waters above, bringing order to the universe.
Right. And Engelbrecht makes the argument that Jesus himself is now the permanent, immovable firmament. He is the absolute barrier separating the chaos and darkness of this fallen temporary world from the eternal kingdom of light.
He is the structural doorway that humanity must intentionally push through to escape the chaos and reach the tree of life. So the final question you have to ponder as you navigate your week is this: what does it physically and spiritually look like for you to cross that firmament?
What specific chaos, what specific hireling narratives are you required to leave behind in order to push through that barrier and enter his peace?
And answering that requires you to go all the way back to the diagnostic question that started the entire book. Mark chapter 8. Who do you say that I am?
The way you answer that question dictates which side of the firmament you live on.
The answer is the only thing that matters. The identity of Jesus isn't something you can just file away in a historical cabinet. It is the central architectural reality of the universe that demands a response. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep analyzing the sources, and we will see you next time.